Okay, welcome back. We're going to continue on with the endocrine system now, talking about the HPA axis and all the parts therein. So let's go ahead and get stuck in here. Let's see here. We're going to do this guy right there. Okay, so what we've got here are the first two parts of the HPA axis, the hypothalamus up here and the pituitary down below. The third part, the adrenal gland, obviously is by the kidney, adrenal by the kidney. And the reason we talk about the HPA axis so much, we worry so much about it, for a couple of different reasons. Number one, we call it the HPA axis because what we find is that there's actually kind of this continuous chain of command, basically, in terms of what gets produced and what gets released by each of these parts, starting at the top with the hypothalamus, kind of an overall control, and then from there down to the pituitary gland, and then from there, sometimes from the pituitary to either the thyroid gland or to the adrenal gland or what have you. A lot of the signals end up going to the adrenal gland. And from there, right, what we end up doing is controlling some pretty important body-wide functions. Control of metabolic rate, control of growth rate, control of blood pressure, control of just any number of stress responses, all kinds of different things that go into it. So it's actually a really vital component of the whole deal. And where we're going to start, right, of course, obviously, is up here with the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is not an endocrine thing, right? We learned about it with the brain, but there are some of these neurons here, right? These neurosecretory neurons, these things that we learned about in the last video, that produce electrical signals and then release chemicals at an axon terminal, but not to a synapse or into a synaptic cleft, but instead into the bloodstream. And so they're going to come down from the hypothalamus into this sort of longer extension here and into the capillaries within that deposit there. They're chemicals. At this point, of course, they are then hormones. Now, these are a special class of hormone that we call a releasing hormone. And the reason that we call them releasing hormones is that they are in turn responsible for the release of other hormones, right? We call them tropic hormones or things like that. This is what they are responsible for. Now, from there, we're going to be influencing the pituitary, which is this little guy right here. And you can see here, maybe you can see this, I hope you can see this, that it's actually two very distinct parts. We have an anterior pituitary right in front and a posterior pituitary behind. And the reason we divide them out is that they're actually made from two very different kinds of tissue. The posterior pituitary here is nervous tissue. It is neuroendocrine, right? And it is actually just a downgrowth of the hypothalamus. It's connected to the brain. It's the same tissue as the brain, right? The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, is epithelial, right? And it actually grows out of, fairly early on in development, grows out of the oral epithelium. If you remember from comparative, if you took comparative with me last term, we talked about Rathke's pouch. This is what Rathke's pouch eventually becomes, this anterior pituitary. It pinches off, it migrates backward, and we end up attaching ourselves here to the pituitary at the infundibulum. Now from there, right, depending if we're anterior or posterior pituitary, we're going to be responsible for releasing different sets of hormones. The anterior pituitary produces many, but these are really sort of the key, most important ones, okay? And some of these are going to be tropic hormones, right? They're going to end in tropin, okay? And these are going to be hormones that then go on to a different gland and cause the release of more hormones, right? So we can talk about thyrotropin or thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. If you want to call it thyroid stimulating hormone, that's fine. It makes more sense to me to call it that than thyrotropin, because what does it do? It stimulates the thyroid gland, right? And from there, the thyroid gland then is stimulated to release thyroid hormone. And there's a couple of different kinds of thyroid hormone. We're not going to worry about those. We remember thyroid hormones, I'm happy with that. And this is important because these hormones then have profound impacts on metabolic rate. The more of it there is, the higher the metabolic rate. And of course, from there, also control growth, particularly early on prepubescent mammals, things like that. We have another tropic hormone here, adrenocorticotropin, which goes to the adrenal cortex, as you might guess from the name, or ACTH. This then stimulates the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids, so a special class of steroid hormones, things like cortisol, corticosterone. And these are involved in the stress response. So we'll talk about stress responses later on. A lot of these have a role in one of our two stress responses. We also have a series of tropic hormones called gonadotropins, which go to the gonads, right? And these are luteinizing hormone, or LH, okay? And luteinizing hormone causes the production and secretion of sex hormones, so your estrogens, your androgens, what have you. And then follicle stimulating hormone, which does basically what it says. It causes stimulation of the follicle in the ovary. So it is a hormone that guides the maturation of eggs in the female, and also the production of sperm in males. There are a handful of other different hormones here, some of them more well understood than others. So things like growth hormone, for example, we understand fairly well. Growth hormone has a couple of different targets. It goes to the liver, where it produces these growth factors, right, which of course are resulting in growth, okay? They also target muscle and or fat, right, with the positive or negative action on metabolic rate. We have melanocyte stimulating hormone. I'm sorry, I don't have a little call out for that, but melanocyte stimulating hormone causes us to produce more melanin in our melanocytes. So this results in skin darkening. Not in you and me like a tan, but we see it in amphibians, reptiles, not birds, but other reptiles and fish. And then finally, prolactin, again, depending on which kind of animal you are. If you're a mammal, this acts on the mammary glands for milk production, not milk release, that's a different hormone, but milk production. In vertebrates, just in general, it plays various roles in reproductive behaviors, water balance. It plays a small role in some animals with regard to care of the young, stuff like that. The posterior pituitary, we release a couple of hormones here. Of course, I don't have them on here. These are vasopressin, so I will, in the description, the video below, I'll have the names of those here. Vasopressin, which is an antidiuretic, okay, so it causes us to retain water. And then oxytocin, which has a pretty profound role in mammalian parturition. So it causes uterine contractions, it causes milk release, right? So we had prolactin before causing milk production. Here we have oxytocin, the release of milk from those mammary glands. Men also produce it. Reasons that are maybe a little esoteric and not really particularly well understood, I don't think, but they do also produce it. And then the final part here of the HPA axis, right, the adrenal gland. Now the adrenal gland itself, we divide into two parts. Okay, we have a cortex and a medulla. The cortex is divided into three parts. The zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. Each of these three different zones is responsible for different sets of hormones that are being produced. So the zona reticularis, the reticulated zone, here produces sex hormones, mostly male sex hormones, generally speaking, so androgens. The middle part here, the zona fasciculata, okay, divided into fascicles, okay. This is where those glucocorticoids come from. So we talked about adrenocorticotropic hormone 4, right? This is going to act here at the zona fasciculata. And then the outermost layer here, the zona glomerulosa here, this is going to secrete mineralocorticoids, okay? So these are going to be steroid hormones based around minerals, right? In particular here, the one we're going to worry about is aldosterone, okay? Because this has a role in blood pressure and blood volume. The middle part here, the medulla, which is actually a displaced ganglion. It's actually neural tissue. Okay, so it's very much like the pituitary in that we have both epithelial and neural tissue here. But the adrenal medulla here, this is going to secrete catecholamines, so some of our amino acid hormones we've talked about before. So the HPA axis then, right, basically is going to work in this kind of fashion, right? It is hypothalamus controlling release of things from the pituitary, right? It's going to cause release of things from the adrenal cortex and to the pituitary anyway. Causes release from adrenal cortex, which then goes out and does all kinds of different stuff, right? And the ultimate control of this, right, can be a couple of different things, right? It can go back to some of those biological or circadian rhythms that we've talked about before the break. It can be stress, okay? It can be lots of different things. Ultimately though, right, we kind of go through this step-by-step process. And the end result, right, might be increased metabolic and growth rates and things like muscle and bone, right? It can be the production of new glucose in the liver. It can be the breakdown of fats. It can be, in terms of stress release responses, it can depress your immune system, right? Which is why it's so important right now to try to remain as cool and calm as you possibly can, right? And like most systems, right, this is going to operate on a negative feedback kind of loop, right? So the release of one hormone kind of turns off the one above it, right? So we have these releasing hormones here that cause the anterior pituitary to release hormones. These have downstream effects, right? But they also have negative feedback effects on the hypothalamus. And the same thing here true with the adrenal gland, right? We have downstream effects, but also we go and we shut off the systems above us a little bit. Okay, all right. So when we come back to the next video here, we'll talk about how some of these hormones might interact with one another, how they're going to work together and cause kind of more sophisticated responses in various systems in the body.